Well, welcome everyone. My name is Melissa Haas and I'm the Director of Development and Programming here at the Southwest Harbor Public Library. I have to tell you, I am so excited for tonight. I'm going to tell you a little story first. So 2 summers ago, I went with my husband to Terramore to their Pints for a Purpose with Friends of Acadia and saw Earl Brecklin talk about postcards and the history of Bar Harbor and the park through his postcards. And of course, he had one that referenced the Fire 47. I was like, okay, I know about this. I've lived here a couple of years now. I know what this is about. And then this lovely woman raises her hand and says, well, I was there. I lived through that. And I went, excuse me, what now? And so I was fortunate enough to chat with Diane later and got to hear some more stories. And then last summer, I saw she was talking about the fire and her experience at Terramore. And I went, man, we just talked about this. Do you come and participate in our art auction? So I emailed her and I said, would you do it here at Southwest Harbor Public Library? And we had a lovely chat just the end of last summer. And so she was officially the first person we booked for our entire 2024 slate of programs. And if you've seen our list, we are quite busy this summer. So I'm not going to waste your time. You don't want to hear from me. We are so appreciative to have you all here and to have Diane tell her story, to be able to welcome our friends via Zoom. So if any of you people on Zoom have questions, Kate Pickup, our Director of Technology and Programming, can help field those when we get to the end. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Diane.
Thank you. Hey, Kate, I have to ask you if the mic is right, because we practice this. The mic good?
How are we in the back?
Can you hear me back there?
Yeah.
Great. Well, first, welcome. I'm thrilled. When they said it was sold out, I was like, oh my gosh, the pressure, And then I also want to welcome all my friends online. I know there are quite a few, some that grew up in Bar Harbor when I grew up during that time, and some I went to college with, and other friends that I've met over the years. So I really welcome all those online too. Well, before I start, I do want to thank Melissa. The list of speakers, I might have been the first, but boy, I am not the best, because I have looked at the speakers and there are some really good things coming up. So you all should check it out. It's only about half done the season, so that's great. And Kate, thank you so much for all your tech work and getting my friends online. I really appreciate that. Last year when I did the talk at Terramore, it was in September, and it was just the time of the fires in Hawaii, in Maui. And this year, I went online yesterday. There are 92 plus fires actively going out, mostly out west and in Canada and in the Southwest right now. So before I begin, I'd like us all to take just a moment to think about the children. Think about everybody, but the children, some of them who were 7, like I was, and think of how their lives are being impacted by these fires now, and by so many other things, the storms we had here this past winter, all the problems we're having with global warming and everything. So if you could I just want to take a second, take a breath, and however you send out your messages out there, think of them. Thank you. I'm going to do this program in 3 parts. The first part is I'm going to tell you what I know about the fire and what my personal experiences were. And the second part, I have some ringers in the audience because I know some people are here that have experiences of their own, but I might not know all of you that do. So that will be the second part. And then the third part will be anyone who wants to ask questions of either me or anybody that speaks. So 1947. The war had been over for a year, whatever. Things are getting back to normal. And the winter started very cold and dreary, cold, snowy. And people were really looking forward to a chance to celebrate, so they were really anxious for spring. But spring came. It rained on this island all April, all May, and into the third week of June. People were ready for summer by then. And it got sunny and it got warm and it was beautiful. And as a 7-year-old, I was outside playing every day at the beach, having a picnic, doing all the things that kids love to do when you can get out and about. But by end of August, when it hadn't rained much at all, people were beginning to be worried about it. There was talk of fires. There were fires that were starting, brush fires in Maine all over the place. And the danger sign at the fire station had gone into extreme. But everybody thought, well, fall is coming, and usually we have some rainy days in fall. Everything will be fine. So Labor Day came. I got off to school, 2nd grade, and again, outdoor recess every day. It was beautiful. When you were a kid, you loved to be able to go home after school and play outside. But the danger got worse and worse. And fires broke out, some big fires in Kennebunk and Brownsfield and all through. And I found out tonight from a fellow that was here, and he can speak to it later, that we also had some minor, or maybe not minor, but brush fires up in Salisbury Cove and the Hulls Cove area. Well, on October 18th, well, no, sorry, no, 17th, excuse me. Mrs. Gilbert. Now, if anybody knows her first name, I would love to know her first name. Every time I look this woman up, she's only Mrs. Gilbert. But Mrs. Gilbert, who lived on the Crooked Road, which is a little west of the major part of Hulls Cove, looked out her window about 4:30 in the afternoon as she was standing at her kitchen sink. I'm imagining cutting vegetables for dinner, and she saw smoke. So right away, she picked up her phone and she called our fire department and spoke to our fire chief at the time, David Sleeper. And she told him there was a fire. She wasn't sure if it was in the cranberry bog or Dolliver's dump. She couldn't quite tell from her perspective, but there was fire and it needed to be put out. So Chief Sleeper sent some people up, one of them being Huck Spratt, who lived up the street from me and told me about it. They thought they had it all put out. They went up, they put it out, they stayed around for a while, seemed to be fine, and they went back to the fire station. The fire wasn't out. The fire was smoldering underground. And by middle of, well, early morning, I mean, first thing that when people first got up, there was fire in Dolliver's dump, and quite significant. So again, a whole fire station goes up and they're working on it, but this fire was so stubborn. They would put out one part and then it would pop up someplace else, because again, it was all smoldering underground by roots and by whatever is in the dump, of course. And everybody asked, well, how did it get started? And there are two theories that I've heard. Somebody may have another one. One is that one of the workers, either at the dump or the cranberry bog, had thrown out a cigarette and they thought it was out and it wasn't. And that was the most popular one when I was growing up. That's what everybody said. But there was another thing that could have happened, and that is some glass in the dump could have acted as a magnifying glass and started the fire. Then we'd have nobody to blame. That would be the best way to start the fire. Anyway, they worked really for the next couple of days, and it got worse. So National Park joined in, and all the firehouses on the island, all through that weekend. And it just burned about 2,000 acres in a couple of days' time. But they would keep putting it out. Start, stop, start, stop. And finally, the winds were really getting bad. And by Monday, they had to call people from Camden. They came from Belfast, Bucksport, Bangor. the Dow base, which is outside of Bangor, and many Bar Harbor young man who was at the University of Maine, Colby, Bates, Bowdoin, they came home to help save their parents' house. But we kept going to school. What we noticed was that the kids who lived in Salisbury Cove and Hulls Cove were not coming to school because the buses couldn't find a safe route to get them back and forth. But those of us who live right in town and walked to school went. On Thursday, the 23rd, the fire and the wind kicked up so badly that, in fact, there were reports that the wind might have been 80 to 90 miles an hour. I don't have that for a fact, but it's written that way. And it shifted and headed straight down what was called Millionaire's Row at the time, the road that goes between Hulls Cove and Bar Harbor, Eden Street, Route 3, and it went at a whip speed, jumping from house to house, or I should say, cottage to cottage. But, you know, and it burned ferociously. Now, by this time, it was all hands on deck. We had people from all over trying to fight the fire. Around noontime that day, I was in school, and Mrs. Ethel Connors, yes, the school that's named after her today, Mrs. Ethel Connors, who was our principal, came in, and she told us that they had decided to take everyone out of town. We were going to be evacuated. I learned a new word that day. I was so proud of myself. Evacuated. I'm going to be evacuated. And she said we had to get in groups for our streets and walk each other home because, and I quote, there will be no dilly-dallying. That was her word. You couldn't dilly-dally, you had to get right home because you had to get ready to evacuate. So I got with the kids from Kennebec Street, and we walked up School Street, crossed across Mount Desert, and went through the old cemetery that's right there between St. Saviour's and the Congregational Church, went through the cemetery, and as we were going down Kennebec Street, one kid would leave to go into their house and so forth. Suzanne Weist and I were the last two on the street. We said goodbye to each other. I turned to go the long sidewalk to the house, and my grandmother was standing on the porch like this. Now, my grandmother always stood like this. That was not a grouchy stance. It was just the way she stood. And beside her was a little suitcase. She was Norwegian. I can't really do it anymore. I used to be good at this, but she said something like, "You got to pack your suitcase." And I said, "I know, we're evacuating." I must have used that word 100 times in the next week or so, I'm sure. But anyway, but I said, "Well, where's Mommy?" Well, my mother was a telephone operator, and my mother was not going to go with us, which was the first crushing blow, right? So I said, "Oh, well, why, you know, and where's Grampy?" And Grampy wasn't going to go with us either because my grandfather was a plumber. Now, he had been talking at dinner table about working on fire, but I didn't really know it. I didn't really feel it until it was happening to me, you know. Except for one story that he told one night at dinner. He said that the hoses were getting so hot that they actually were beginning, some of them were beginning to unpeel, and they couldn't hold them anymore. And they were all, and of course, the lines that he had to keep opening pipes and doing stuff and getting water, making sure the water was there. And my mother had talked a little bit about the phone calls they were getting at the phone company. They were getting phone calls from as far away as Paris because of the wealthy, famous people that lived there. And it was reported in a newspaper in Paris about the fire, and all over the whole country. It became quite the sensational fire, even though Kennebunk had been a big fire and so had Brownsfield. They made local news, but they didn't make national and international news. So I knew that they were both involved with the fire, but now I'm leaving. And I'm thinking, I can't leave without my mother, right? But I have to do what my grandmother says, and she also said that my aunt Agnes and her 6-month-old cousin Judy, who might be on Zoom today, if you are Judy, I love you. We're gonna go with us. So I go upstairs, I take her suitcase, gonna pack. She tells me we're gonna be a week in Ellsworth with my uncle, and I needed pajamas and underwear, socks, everything. I go upstairs. I packed the things I need. I'm 7. I come downstairs and my grandmother's standing there again. Open the suitcase. And I said, no, I don't open the suitcase. Open the suitcase. Okay, I opened it. I had packed my 2 favorite dolls and all their clothes. So upstairs I go. Now my grandma was very smart because I said, I gotta take my dolls. Well, we couldn't. There wasn't, everybody had one bag they could take. That was the rule because we're all gonna get in these army trucks and stuff in the back of them, and they can't bring things with you. So she said, leave your dolls on your mother's bed. She's gonna miss you and she's gonna need company. That made perfect sense to me. I took the dolls out, I left them with all their clothes, thinking my mother would have to change their clothes daily like I did, but probably didn't happen. And I kissed them, went in, packed underwear, socks, pajamas, some outfits, and I came back downstairs. And you know, my grandmother didn't ask me to open it again. She knew I would do what she told me to do. Which, you know, I don't know, as a mother and a grandmother now, I might check twice, I'm not sure. I can't guarantee. So we all got ready, my aunt, my cousin, myself, my grandmother, and my grandfather and my mother came home because they had cars. And they were gonna drive us down to the athletic field. And so they drive us down. Now, that was probably, I guess by this time, 3 o'clock or so, because my mother stayed with us for a little while, but she was doing the, if you can believe this, Carol, 4 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. Carol's a friend of my mother's. So she left at 4, and the place, the athletic field, I wouldn't say it was chaotic. It really wasn't. It didn't feel that way to me. It didn't feel scary or anything, but it was noisy because everybody's looking for somebody that they're evacuating out with. They're calling names and everything. And it was a long time. And what I remember most about it, because the fire was getting really close to town, the smell. The smell was like no smell. It wasn't not like a campfire at all. It wasn't like a fireplace. It wasn't one like a wood stove. Didn't smell any of those smells. This fire was burning cars, so burning rubber. It was melting refrigerators and washing machines and everything and all that acrid stuff that was in the air. So it really, more than smell, it tasted terrible. And we're waiting there at the athletic field. And what we didn't know was that the Camden Fire Department could really thank Camden for saving downtown Bar Harbor. As the fire was whipping down Eden Street Route 3 into town, they decided to make a stand. And they decided to make a stand at the corner of West Street and Eden Street. And in order to do it, they had to burn down a huge hotel, which they purposely burnt down because what was happening with the fire, it was jumping from roof to roof to roof. And they needed a space where it had nothing to jump to. So they burnt down that hotel, which saved La Rochelle, the next house down, which is now the Bar Harbor Historical Society, that beautiful building would not have been saved. So it saved West Street and in effect, the town. Now, the Camden Fire Department made a stand there and they did that, and that was really important. And something else happened. Someone else helped out. I don't know if you believe, but the wind shifted. Right then, when it was going towards town, it shifted as they worked on the hotel. And it headed up over towards Eagle Lake, up by the Kibo golf course and everything. And it got out of the way. Then they saw an opening. While things were still burning on both sides of Route 3, they had basically gotten the raging fire under control there. I mean, there were fires on both sides of the street. And they opened up that road for evacuation. It was dark by then. As I said, my mother left me at 4. She left me with my grandmother. This had to be close to 8:30 or 9. They started the evacuation. It was dark. And we took in a very slow procession from the athletic field all the way down Main Street to the wharf. And there were people on the wharf that were evacuating by boat. 200 and some people left on a boat and went over to Gouldsboro and Sullivan. So we're going down, we turn on West Street, everything looks normal, and then we come to the hotel. And the fire burning on both sides of the road. We had been given blankets doused, wet, to put over our heads because the truck was open. Now, the good news was for my cousin, Judy, she being so young, she and my aunt got to sit up front with the National Guard person and in the clothes because they were so afraid of her breathing the smoke, right? But what the firemen did as we went up Union Street was their hoses are this way and they're putting out the fire, and we go by and they shoot the fire up in the hoses up in the air, and we got drenched, literally drenched. And within seconds we were dry again, but we'd go a little further and they do it again and again and again, and got us all the way to the bluffs. And at the bluffs, we now had the ocean on the side, just a few sparks, not much. And Hulse Cove, the fire was already out in Hulse Cove. So we drove into Hulse Cove and then picked up speed and headed to Ellsworth. What I didn't know, you're all that, which was scary to me, of course, which was scary to me. What I didn't know was this was a much scarier time for my mother. My mother at the phone company was working with a friend of hers, Charlotte Stewart. Charlotte had put Cynthia on one of the transport trucks with her relatives, and my mother had left me on one. Well, if you read this book, Wildfire Loose, which is the story of the year Maine burned, you will read in it that the success of the daring evacuation was marred by a traffic accident. At the telephone office, Charlotte Stewart and Lillian Ingalls, that was my mother, both of whose young daughters had been evacuated, got a phone call that said a Bar Harbor girl had been injured and fell off the truck, but they didn't know her name. So my mother is waiting to find out the name. Well, Mrs. Cormier, it turns out, and her 2 daughters had gone on a truck together. The Cormiers were sitting on the left side, and young Helen was on the end by the tailgate, her mother next to her, and then Jane holding tightly to the leash of Tippy, their dog. The road passed a steep rise called the Bluffs, where we had just been, where the land dropped away to the other side of the ocean, just wide enough for 2 cars. It was a narrow road for the truck to maneuver. From where she was sitting, Jane could peer out to see the embers from the bluffs over the truck and down the embankment. It was a tense, frightening ride, but then now they're out of the danger zone. almost into Hell's Cove. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief when suddenly a Jeep rammed the back of the truck, overturning it. Jane's sister Helen was thrown out and under the truck. She suffered a fractured skull and died 3 days later. A great loss to her family and the community. She will be remembered as an outstanding young woman. And she was one of my babysitters. The other fatality in that crash was a 41-year-old Dowfield warrant officer named Walter Coates. He died on the scene. So my mother is now calling my Aunt Margie, where we're gonna go to stay. She's there. My Uncle Walter is going to the City Hall in Ellsworth looking for us. We're not there yet. And my mother calls Aunt Margie. You know, is Diane there yet? Is Mom, Diane, are they there yet? Not yet. Walter's gone down to meet them, but he hasn't brought them back yet. Nobody could call in. My mother had to make all the phone calls. What had happened when that fire came down Route 3, it burned the telephone poles, it burned the wires. They were all cut off completely, except for Southwest Harbor. So my mother and Charlotte worked all night long. And also in this book. Charlotte Stewart and Lillian Ingalls manned the Bar Harbor telephone exchange from 4 o'clock Thursday afternoon until 7 the next morning. From the windows of the telephone office, they were able to watch the fire's progress along Eden Street. As it advanced, telephone lines went dead, one after another. Each time a light would come on, I'd go into it to see if it was a call or I could just hear noise. If the line was out of order, my mother and Charlotte would give the number to the wire chief and he'd pull the coils to save the juice for whatever telephones were still working. When at last the only line out of Bar Harbor was still open was to Southwest Harbor, Charlotte and Lillian took turns manning it all night long. Charlotte remembers, Lily and I talked at Southwest Harbor all night long. We were never cut off for 1 minute. But they were the only ones, so that my mother, in order to get in touch, she had to make the call. Nobody could call into Bar Harbor at that time unless they knew how to do it. My mother made 3 phone calls. The last one, it was ringing when we walked into Uncle Walter's house. And Aunt Margie said, pick up the phone, Diane. It's for you. So I picked up the phone and my mother had a good night the rest of the night. And I'm not sure when Charlotte found out that Cynthia was all right, but she was all right also. So that was the evacuation and the most dramatic part of the story for me. But we did spend the weekend in Ellsworth. The good news was that my mother was a telephone operator. I had many friends who didn't hear from their fathers who had gone back to fight or their mothers because they didn't have an access to the phone. But my mother called at least 3 times a day to reassure me that she was fine. My dolls were fine also. And that the fire did not come into the center of town. About a week went by and there was an all clear. My Aunt Agnes, who was actually, she was from Providence, she'd been visiting to bring the baby for my grandmother to see, well, for us all to see. We took her to Bangor, put her on the train to Boston, she and my cousin, and her husband picked her up in Boston, they lived in Providence. But my grandmother and I stayed for the duration of the evacuation. And Uncle Walter took us back when it was all clear and we could go. But it wasn't really what you would call all clear. Uncle Walter, who had been in the Navy and served in the Pacific, never did serve on land in Europe. But as we came in, he said that everything reminded him of all the pictures he had seen of the burned out towns that had been bombed in France and Germany and all through Europe. And it was like that. What you saw, and again, smell was terrible. Awful, but what you saw was chimneys. Just chimneys still smoldering. And cars that had burned and just left there as rubble. As you're coming into town, it really did look like a bombed out area of a war zone. And it was very scary. But it's amazing what something like that can do for a town. You know that saying, it takes a village, of course, we all know that. It does, it really does. That town pulled together, it was changed forever. It went from a place of the rich and famous to a tourist town. By that one incident right there. But they did change, and they made it work. And anyone who was bombed out, any of the locals that were bombed, any of the locals that were burnt out, they moved in with friends. People took them in. There were community suppers at all the churches. Everybody was taken care of. The town pulled together to make a change. And it really was rather inspiring to see that, and to see how well. And school started right up. We got right back to school. Well, couldn't dilly-dally in that either. So we hadn't got started in school right away, and things suddenly became more normal. And I received the other day from somebody who is online today, hi Pat, thank you, a poem written by a great friend of mine. Well, we started out as adversaries. She grew up in Bucksport. I grew up in Bar Harbor. We were both on the high school debating team. We were adversaries all through high school. But in college, we became really good friends, and that friendship has lasted over 60 years. So she is the poet laureate for Bucksport, and she's also our class poet laureate. And she sent me this poem that was published, that she wrote and was published in 2000. And it starts out, you know, when she's a child and goes to what I'm talking about, rebuilding. You learn there's a Bar Harbor and a Mount Desert Island. When the radio says your hometown's sending engines, scared sparks will cross to the mainland. Then the truck ride there, eyes watering to see up close the loss. You don't know, it's instruction for the decades. How the most amazing green spring from burnt ground, no matter how tall. And fog blurred the ghosts of how long they insisted like those charcoal spruce and fir. How seeds come through fire, flare into their best destiny after all. Paper the tent's new growth, nerving against pinks, old as earth. The granite here, pinks, old as earth. I love that. Thank you, Pat, for letting me share that with everyone. So that's my story, and now I'm waiting to hear yours. Thank you. I do have a few ringers in the audience, as I said. So Steve, hold on, who brought these, and I'm gonna pass them around. Steve brought these. Don't keep them, just pass them. Of where the fire burned and the different phases that it burnt in. So.
Yes, that little map that's coming around, I saw in the park headquarters about 15 years ago, and when no one was looking, I took a picture of it. And so we want those back, but that's a map of the progression of the fire from day one to the end, which I think is probably going to be interesting to all of you. My family was in Seal Harbor. We owned what was called the Seaside Inn, which was a hotel. Our rival was the Astaku. If I can get to it, I'm just I'm wobbly, but this is what it looked like, a great big, a 4-story hotel with, we could handle 100 guests a night, something on that, or and this started in the 1880s. My family, the Clement family, were the first settlers of Seal Harbor in 1808. The fountain in the middle of the road in Seal Harbor is to John Clement, the first settler there in Seal Harbor. So the roots are there. Our family was not on the island when the fire happened. But we had an aunt and uncle in Bangor who we called every night to check on the progression of the fire. And of course, Seal Harbor was saved. It ended as far as the bubbles. But that was a sigh of relief because we had the hotel, we had 13 buildings on our property, which there had to be a dormitory for the waitresses. There was a dormitory, there was a garage, there was an ice house. Yeah, all of those, and 3 houses, I think, for guests, and a bunch of us with our own houses and that sort of thing. So we were heavily involved in Seal Harbor, and very pleased to not be burned, but the family was keeping track of it all the way.
Wonderful, thank
So
you.
what's going around is just a map of the fire, which I thought you might be interested in seeing.
I hadn't seen it in color. I see it in the flyer I had, shows it in black and white. It's much more dramatic that way. Thank you.
It's very interesting to me, as I look at some of the vegetation, I wonder a great deal about if you walk the Jessup Path, for example, you'll find a single tree with 4 or 5 or 6 smaller roots coming out of it. And I wonder if those were destroyed by the fire, and the roots are surviving and coming up. It's very interesting to walk. Also, if you go along the Schooner Head Road, there's something really weird along there. All the trees are the same size, the same shape. All those little trees. I'm convinced that everything was burned, and those are survivors. There's all those kinds of places here and there scattered around Acadia. And if you're at the beach at I gotta look at my note here.
Keep your paper out.
Eagle Lake. If you go to the Eagle Lake Beach and turn left and look at the hill on the far side, you can see a demarcation line very distinctly between the area that is of evergreens and the deciduous trees. It's more apparent, of course, in the fall and the spring, but now.
Yes, and
Now.
before it was all evergreens.
Yes,
What happened
absolutely.
was that the deciduous trees grew up first, like Pat said, they just seeds. They grew up a lot. That's why we have a lovely fall here. But when I was young, everything was evergreen. They grow slower. I also have somebody with an artifact. I can't believe it, Marta. Thank you so much, Steve.
And about 5 years ago, I was going through some old papers, and I find some scrap like this. It looks like the shape of an envelope, and it's a draft letter that my mother wrote to some relatives in the Midwest immediately after the fire. I transcribed it so you wouldn't have to listen to me figure that out. But just to give you a little context, my parents moved here in 1935 or so. And my dad was an early scientist at the Jackson Lab. This was his first job out of graduate school. And by the time of the fire, they had purchased their first home a couple of years before, very happy with their dream home. My brother was almost 4 and I was a year and a half. Our house burned in the fire and the Jackson lab where my dad worked burnt to the ground as well. So. What did they do? What did they do?
Well, this is the story.
Well, no, this is, she means the follow. I'll read the letter first. Dear Odell and Velma, I hardly know where to start. I feel a bit dazed and numb. As you probably read, we had a forest fire near Bar Harbor, which seemed under control, and then came a sudden shift of wind, which blew a terrific gale. The fire got completely out of control, and we had just 10 minutes to grab warm clothes and run for our lives, or I should say, drive. Dr. Little, he was the head of the lab, came to our house to warn us and insisted that we come to their house because it was considered safe. They lived on Wayman Lane. By the time we had driven the mile to their house, it was surrounded, the town was surrounded by flames and no one was safe and we could not get out of town. We drove to an estate on the shore where there was a large grass lawn. It was surrounded by trees and the fire kept coming nearer. We realized that the heat and smoke would be too much for us, although we were on a cleared area and had blankets to wet and throw over ourselves. So we abandoned our cars, the little 2 cars and ours, and walked to along the shore to the town pier, where we hoped the Coast Guard would send boats to rescue us. By this time, the Army had taken over the town and opened a closed Navy building where we sat for hours. The entire town did not burn as the wind shifted again, and later that night, one of the roads off island was considered fairly safe as the woods on both sides had finished burning. So we were convoyed through the burning trees to Ellsworth, where we spent the night. Our car did not burn, so we drove out in it. Many people went out in Army trucks, and there were several accidents, and a young girl who had sat with us while we were waiting to be evacuated was killed on the way, so we were fortunate. It was very smoky and dangerous driving, but it was safer than staying in town, as they were still not sure they could save the town. Small boats were taking people out by water. But the sea was so rough that we were afraid to go by boat. George, meaning my husband, had a speaking engagement the following Monday, which he did not like to cancel, but hated to leave us with no place in Maine. It seemed very safe. So many fires were raging that you didn't know which town might be next. We finally decided to drive to New York, although the report said that some highways were impassable due to forest fires. We knew that no traffic was allowed into Maine, but we thought we would be allowed to leave, and we were. We were held up because of firefighting once or twice, and the smoke was thick, but we didn't have any bad scares. On the way, Margaret, that's what they used to call me, vomited and had diarrhea. And we were worried about her, but she is better now. That's it.
You watch that,
That's so, there's more to the letter, but there was actually 2 weeks between, apparently, from what I can see, when she started it and when she finished it, because I think life was chaos. And let me just add, my mother always had stories about moving either 9 times in 8 months or 8 times in 9 months, right after the fire.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Myrtle. That was so. You want to say something about what was happening up at the Salisbury Cove even before the fire?
Okay, I'm Chris White, and my father helped bring the bio lab up here. And then later ended up with the Jackson lab. But I remember probably in the summer of 47, there were lots of fires all over the state of Maine, but there were also here. And I was probably at that time about 7 years old.
You were 7, we were in first grade together.
Yeah, but I didn't come into the school until the 5th grade, but, you know, what was happening with the bio lab was they'd get a phone call and they'd be told where there was a fire. And the men would go grab rakes and whatever and go off to fight the fire. And then, of course, I was always playing around down around the lab. And so they'd throw me and my buddies in the back of a pickup truck and we'd go where they were fighting the fire. They'd say, stay with the truck because we may have to get out of here. And then fast forward, 1949, our house that we were living in Salisbury Cove burned to the ground. And I will tell you that Asa Wasga, who owned the Bar Harbor Times, and people, they came to us and said, you know, we've been through a fire. And so my mother and all the ladies around would go to Adler's to get reclothed and Saxman's for the men. And, you know, it's just, and and again, fast forward to just down here, what's going on down here with Seawall, the different attitudes, the attitude of island living and country living and everybody helping one another out. It's not competition, it's help one another make things happen.
That's wonderful. All the people in Southwest that work together to get the seawall road open, amazing. And it's the kind of thing that we did have after the fire. Is there somebody, before I go back to Steve, is there somebody else that had something they wanted to say and I forgot? No? I mean, Steve, you want to come and have a question? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Not only to speak or anything like.
Well, I'd like you to.
I'll just,
What's your name?
my name is Ruth Chase Mitchell. I was born and raised in Northeast Harbor. I was a freshman in high school. And I remember about the fire. I remember our principal, Carl Kelly, stood up in the main room, we called it, and said, I need all available males who will come to the desk and speak with me immediately. We are going to help fight a fire that's happening over on the Crooked Road at Dollar's Dump. So that started the routine for the girls and the home economics teacher, Mrs. Leonard, to go down in the building below the post office. We had coffee and we made sandwiches and we had tea and we had all kinds of donations that would come in, and the younger men who weren't allowed to go near the fire would get the foods over there to the people that needed it. My brother next to me, Lowell Chase, he did a lot of firefighting in the tarn. And he used to carry on his back one of these containers that they called it slipped my mind. But it was a container, what do they call it? Full of water. And they would just canteen, well, it's like a canteen, but it was huge, it covered the whole back, and they stayed over there for hours trying to fight the fire.
Right, and thank you for mentioning the girls, because last year when I did the speech, one person was there that was a teenager at Bar Harbor High School said that all the girls got together down in the kitchen every day to make sandwiches for all these volunteers. I've also read in different accounts that one thing that women remember when their husbands came home, like back to Bucksport from the fire department of Camden or whatever, that I don't want to see another sandwich.
I also worked for the telephone company in Northeast.
Yeah.
I didn't work during the fire.
When you were a teenager.
Was
Yes.
13, 14,
Right, yes.
freshman.
They didn't allow you to work at full time.
Right, and I didn't, I worked in the summertime.
And anyone else during this? Yes. And your name?
I was 9 years old and going to school in Otter Creek. And of course, I went over I read in the Bar Harbor Times that the fire truck was spraying the dump out there. So I wanted to see the fire truck in action, so got my dad to take me out there, but there was no fire truck. That was bad. And but there was little flames here and there on the dump, but it was glowing and smoky. Well, about 3 days later, I went back, got him to talk, because I really wanted to see the fire truck in action. Well, it wasn't there. That's bad. I don't think the fire department would like me to say that, but anyway, I never did get to see the fire truck in action. Then, so that lady, this was after the lady that you spoke of, that called
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, the next day.
My dad had a Gulf station, filling station in a store in Otter Creek. And of course, the electricity went out. As soon as that Jackson Lab area and along the road over there.
Right.
The electricity was gone, right? So I had to stand out in front of the service station for several days, telling people coming through from Bar Harbor, they couldn't get through over there. They were blocked somewhere along the
Right.
bluffs. So they all came through Otter Creek, the ones that left earlier.
Right.
And I stood up there all day long. Oh, sorry, we don't have any gas, can't pump gas. So, my dad and all the other men, was just like in Bar Harbor, he was fighting the fire all the time. And, we'd only see him at night, come down, he's tired out. And, of course, the store wasn't operating or anything, no electricity.
Yeah, right.
Anyway.
We never forget, do we?
Hmm.
So we never forget.
Oh, yeah.
It's a very,
Anyway, the thing I remember was when we finally had to leave because the fire was over on the other side of Otter Creek there towards the point.
Yeah.
Mostly it burned on the left side of that road that you go to called Otter Cliffs Drive. Everything on the left of that burned.
Yeah.
I don't think anything on the right of that burned like the map shows, but maybe it did.
oh, I did.
There was one lady over there that lived on the left side, the wrong side of the road, and her house burned down. But she stood out there and her relatives came and, do I need this?
Yeah.
No, yes, okay. Okay, anyway, they didn't have room for her luggage. So she had to leave it on her lawn. Her house burned down, the lawn burned. When she came back, the fire had burned around the suitcases. And it was quite a deal because my dad even took me out there and everybody in town was talking about it. We couldn't figure out why the suitcases. But there were 3 spots there where her suitcases were. Okay, we finally had to leave because it was getting too close. And I said, what am I gonna do with all my rabbits? So he said, you can't do anything. He said, just let them out. I said, well, what's gonna happen to them? He said, they'll just walk down the hill and go to the end of the water and save themselves, He said, they're not just gonna stand there to be burned. Well, when I came back, I said, thanks, Dad, for putting the rabbits up for me. And he said, no, I didn't. I said, who did? He said, the army guys caught them and put them back in there. Well, I wanted to say that, mainly that, the night that we finally left, Dad didn't come down off the mountain until after 10, and Mother and I were really worried about getting out of there. And, guess what? When we got to Northeast Harbor, we ran out of gas.
Electricity up there.
He had to go to 4 summer house garages before he found lawnmower gas to get us off the island. When we came back to Otter Creek in about 5 or 6 days, we could see it from 5 miles north of Ellsworth all night long. I mean, it's unbelievable at night when those mountains burn. Anyway, when we came back, there were 2 big tents right across from the old church in Otter Creek. There was a bigger area there than there is now. Anyway, the Army fed everybody in Otter Creek that was back for nearly 2 weeks. And it was great.
Oh,
Anyway, I can remember it. I was 9 years old.
What is your name, sir?
Hmm?
Your name?
George Davis, Otter Creek.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Because Dad said there's not gonna be any business, any tourist business for at least 10 years. So my mother's mother lived in Texas, so there's where I went to high school.
We have a couple of questions online.
okay, I'm gonna excuse my husband because he has to go get dinner.
Okay,
I gotta go get lobster.
Yeah.
Before they cook.
Yes,
Nice
all
job.
right, we have a question. Where was the telephone company located?
good question. And, you know what location that question is coming from, so I can, how specific I should be. Yeah, anyway, the telephone company, if you're in Bar Harbor and you go to Cottage Street, right to the end where it crosses across Main Street, that red brick building up there, the 3rd floor where the telephone operators were, the 2nd floor was where all the linemen had all their equipment and everything. And on the bottom floor, wasn't the bar, the liquor store, thank you. No wonder I didn't do it. And there's another.
Yes, actually, George Tuttle, I think he can speak. Can you speak, George?
Yeah, it's Georgia, actually. Yes,
Oh,
Georgia
excuse me,
Tuttle.
hold on just a moment. Let me get the volume going for you. Yeah. Okay, try now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Georgia Tuttle from Southwest Harbor. My great uncle was Woodbury Stanley, who worked for the Northeast Harbor Fire Department at that time. And I was lucky to bump into Daniel Pyle, who many of you know, I think was a librarian in Northeast Harbor, who told me the story of how Uncle Woodbury was in charge of burning a backfire that also saved a large portion of the island. I'd be happy to try to get the details of that for the speaker, if or others. The other piece I wanted to throw in was on the Jackson Lab. After that burned to the ground, scientists from around the world who had bought various mice with specific genetic defects got together and restocked the entire Jackson laboratory and rebuilt the inventory of all those rare, extremely rare and valuable mice. So not only was there an island-wide effort, but there was a worldwide effort to rebuild after the fire.
Are there any questions from any of you or any of us? Yes,
What was the name of the hotel that they burned?
I think it was the Marvin. The Bell, what was it? The Gregoire, okay, right. De Gregoire. The Malvern also burned, but that's not the one they burned. The De Gregoire. Thank you.
I'd like
Yes.
to know how many people in here were here during the
Oh,
fire,
raise your hand if you were here during the fire.
if you lived on the island.
If you
during-
lived on the island.
Second part, do you have a
Right.
relative?
Just-
Right.
How many?
People.
Oh, 1, 2,
Yeah, 2
3,
people
4,
in the
5,
audience.
6,
Wait, oh,
7,
Okay.
7 people,
Eight.
8.
8, 9.
And then someone wants to know if you, Mom, if people can raise their hand for if they had a relative who lived.
Or if they had a relative who lived here. Oh, morning. Oh, dear, sorry about, I love my family also, you know. Right, so if you don't have any questions, I really want to thank you so much for being such a great audience and for all of you that helped out. Margot, you just have to say that letter is so poignant. It really
And
is.
it's funny, it kind of confirms what you said.
Right.
And that woman, this young child to die. and,
Yeah.
Leaving
That's
town,
great.
my brother who was almost 40, remembers the burning trees on both sides of the road.
Right. So, good night. Thank you, Southwest Harbor Library. Here at this fantastic place, check out the art as you leave. Bidding starts on August 1st. August 1st.
And if you want to
have
see some of
Bid
Diane's
often, bid high.
Diane's work is upstairs.
My work is upstairs.
All right.